Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to welcome you to the Department of the Interior, which sits on the ancestral homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway people. Land acknowledgements recognize the Indigenous people who are the original stewards of the lands where we live and work. Making them is part of acknowledging who we are and who has been here. It's about the history of the land and the people. This is the same reason that we often speak about traditional or Indigenous knowledge. My ancestors lived sustainably in the Southwest and survived famine and drought with the understanding that future generations would rely on their hard work and sacrifices. I can't help but think about the environmental tragedies that might have been avoided, like the Dust Bowl, the extinction of the passenger pigeon, and the growth of extreme wildfires across the West if the federal government had consulted with and respected the practices of stewarding the earth that Indigenous people developed over millennia. As the federal government moved the country west, they also moved to exterminate, eradicate, and assimilate Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. The languages, cultures, religions, traditional practices, and even the history of Native communities, all of it was targeted for destruction. Nowhere is that clearer than in the legacy of federal Indian boarding schools. For more than a century, tens of thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their communities and forced into boarding schools run by the U.S. government, specifically the Department of the Interior and religious institutions. The consequences of federal Indian boarding school policies, including the intergenerational trauma caused by forced family separation and cultural eradication, which were inflicted upon generations of children as young as 4 years old, are heartbreaking and undeniable. When my maternal grandparents were only 8 years old, they were stolen from their parents' culture and communities and forced to live in boarding schools until the age of 13. Many children like them never made it back to their homes. Each of those children is a missing family member, a person who was not able to live out their purpose on this earth because they lost their lives as part of this terrible system. This is not new to us. It's not new to many of us. As Indigenous people, we have lived with the intergenerational trauma of federal Indian boarding school policies for many years. But what is new is the determination in the Biden-Harris administration to make a lasting difference in the impact of this trauma for future generations. The federal policies that attempted to wipe out Native identity, language, and culture continue to manifest in the pain tribal communities face today, including cycles of violence and abuse, disappearance of Indigenous people, premature deaths, poverty and loss of wealth, mental health disorders, and substance abuse. Recognizing the impacts of the federal Indian boarding school system cannot just be a historical reckoning. We must also chart a path forward to deal with these legacy issues. To address the intergenerational impact of federal Indian boarding schools and to promote spiritual and emotional healing in our communities, we must shed light on the unspoken traumas of the past. Today, we take a critical step forward in that work. Last June, I launched the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, a comprehensive effort to address the legacy of federal Indian boarding school policies. That initiative starts with shining a bright and undeniable spotlight in the form of an investigative report led by Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs Bryan Newland. This report is a significant step by the federal government to address the facts and consequences of these policies. I am so incredibly proud of the work that Assistant Secretary Newland and his entire team did on the first volume of this report. I particularly want to acknowledge the staff at the Bureau of Trust Funds Administration, which is managing the document collection, review, and records management of this initiative. The vast majority of the work being released today was done by Indigenous staff here at the department, in this department in various offices, who worked through their own trauma and pain to ensure that we have this report to release today. I honor all of you for your contributions to moving our country forward to provide a better future for our youth. This report lays the groundwork for the continued research and work of the Interior Department to address the intergenerational trauma and consequences of federal Indian boarding school policies. And with the recent congressional investment of $7 million for this effort in fiscal year 2022, we are grateful to have much needed resources to continue the work. Our efforts will include steps we can and must take now to alter the course of our future. We must work to preserve Native languages. We must invest in support services for Indigenous peoples, and we must bear witness to the stories of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian people. I come from ancestors who endured the horrors of the Indian boarding school assimilation policies carried out by the same department that I now lead. This department was responsible for operating what we now know to be 408 federal boarding schools across 37 states or then territories, including 21 schools in Alaska and 7 schools in Hawaii. Now we are uniquely positioned to assist in the effort to recover the dark history of these institutions that have haunted our families for too long. As a Pueblo woman, it is my responsibility, and frankly, it's my legacy. As part of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative and in response to recommendations from the report, today I am launching a year-long tour, The Road to Healing. I will travel across the country to use my platform to elevate American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian survivors of the federal Indian boarding school system and give them the opportunity to share their stories, help connect communities with trauma-informed support, and facilitate the collection of a permanent oral history. This is one step among many that we will take. The department's work thus far shows that an all-of-government approach is necessary to strengthen and rebuild the bonds within Native communities that federal Indian boarding schools set out to break. With the President's direction, we have begun working through the White House Council of Native American Affairs on the path ahead to preserve tribal languages, invest in survivor-focused services, and honor our trust obligations to Indigenous communities. The fact that I am standing here today as the first Indigenous Cabinet Secretary is testament to the strength and determination of Native people. I am here because my ancestors persevered. I stand on the shoulders of my grandmother and my mother, and the work we will do with the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative will have a transformational impact on the generations who follow. I thank you all so much for being here and for covering this critical issue. And now I want to introduce a colleague that I am so proud to serve next to Assistant Secretary Bryan Newland.
Uju in the way manadu, excuse me. Ani nibana mikana bamose indigenous maingendo dem gnoshikaning ndonjaba. Nishnabe and Dao. I want to thank you all for being here. To the press who are covering this issue that has been ignored for too long. I want to thank the members of our team here at the department. We have so many folks in the back who helped put this report together. It's been an exhausting and emotional effort for them to confront this horror on a daily basis to bring this information to you. I'm deeply grateful for their work, both as a member of Secretary Haaland's leadership team and as somebody who grew up in a family and a community that's been impacted by these boarding schools. Federal Indian boarding schools have had a lasting impact on Native people and communities across America. And that impact continues to influence the lives of countless families, from the breakup of families and tribal nations, to the loss of languages and cultural practices and relatives. Excuse me. This has left lasting scars for all Indigenous people. There's not a single American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian in this country whose life hasn't been affected by these schools. Thank you. We haven't begun to explain the scope of this policy era until now. Under the leadership of Secretary Haaland, the department has for the first time started an investigation of the federal Indian boarding school system. This report that we're releasing to you today places the Indian boarding school system in its historical, legal, and policy context and details initial investigative findings, including an official list of federal Indian boarding schools. This report confirms that this boarding school system was part of a twin United States policy: the dispossession of Indian lands and the forced assimilation of Indian people. The report explains that the federal government pursued this policy of forced assimilation by targeting Indian children. Federal Indian boarding schools were the primary means to carry out this policy. And the report shows that all three branches of the federal government impacted this system. Multiple generations of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children were induced or compelled by the federal government to be brought to these schools, given their political and legal status as Indians and Native Hawaiians, as recognized by the United States Constitution and centuries of Supreme Court precedent and congressional legislation. For this investigation, the department first engaged and consulted with tribes, Alaska Native villages, Alaska Native corporations, and Native Hawaiian communities to incorporate their concerns and views into our work. Through the Bureau of Trust Funds Administration, we identified and examined federal records to develop an official list of federal Indian boarding schools and to identify marked and unmarked burial sites. And through a formal partnership with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, it was instrumental in sharing information and records that contributed to this report. As of today, our work shows that from 1819 to 1969, the United States operated or supported 408 boarding schools across 37 states or then territories, including 21 schools in Alaska and 7 in Hawaii. The report identifies each of those schools by name and location, some of which operated across multiple sites. While generations of Indian and Native Hawaiian children entered these boarding schools, many died, often far from their homes and families. We've identified 53 marked or unmarked burial sites and cemeteries for Indian children across the system, with more site discoveries expected as we continue our research. The department will not make public the specific locations of burial sites associated with this system to protect against very real threats of grave robbing, vandalism, and other desecration. Our initial investigation results show that approximately 50% of federal Indian boarding schools may have received support or involvement from religious institutions or organizations, including funding, infrastructure, and personnel. The federal government at times paid religious institutions and organizations on a per capita basis for Indian children to enter the schools that these institutions and organizations operated. The investigation shows that in addition to congressional appropriations, the United States may have used monies held in tribal trust accounts, including those based on cessions of Indian lands to the United States, to fund Indian children to attend these schools. The report describes the condition that Indian and Native Hawaiian children experienced. These conditions included militarized and identity alteration methodologies on kids. Federal records also affirm that the federal Indian boarding school system discouraged or prevented the use of indigenous languages and focused on vocational training, involvement of manual labor, and Indian children. The report identifies the Running Bear studies, quantitative research based on now adult federal Indian boarding school attendees' medical status that indicates that the boarding school system continues to impact the present-day health of Indian people who participated in that study. These results verify the need for a comprehensive review and report by an independent research group to assess the current impacts that Indian boarding schools have had on American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, including on their health, education, and economic status. In order to complete the objectives of this initiative, I've made 8 recommendations for the next steps of this investigation. Implementation of some of these recommendations will require the help and assistance of Congress. I want to point out that this investigation so far has been conducted with existing congressional appropriations, relying on the service of Bureau of Trust Funds Administration staff and volunteers from other department bureaus. Congress has provided $7 million to the department for advancing this investigation under fiscal year 2022 Consolidated Appropriations Act. This funding will permit us to help find answers to the pressing questions left unexamined in this report. Answers in our next volume we expect to include approximating the total number of children that attended these schools, approximating the total number of marked and unmarked burial sites, identifying names and ages and tribal affiliations of children interred at those burial sites, approximating the amount of federal support for this system, recognizing that some of our records may no longer exist. We will also examine and seek to identify religious institutions and organizations and other non-federal entities that ever received federal funding in support of this boarding school system. While this report spotlights a solemn period in U.S. history, it lays the groundwork for future focused actions outlined in our recommendations. To begin the process of healing from the harm and the violence caused by Indian assimilation policy, the Department of the Interior should affirm an explicit and express policy of cultural revitalization, supporting the work of tribes, Alaska Native villages, and Native Hawaiian communities to revitalize their languages, cultural practices, and traditional food systems, and to protect and strengthen intra-tribal relations. We're engaging and supporting other federal agencies to assist this initiative, including those with control of any relevant records or that provide health care to American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians, including for the provision of mental health services to students attending our Bureau of Indian Education operated and funded schools. Every worthwhile journey begins with its first step. This report is not an end of that journey, it's a beginning. It marks one of the first steps on the road to help begin a healing process in this country. For Indian country and the Native Hawaiian community, the entire United States, and every person in every tribal community from the Alaskan tundra to the Florida Everglades and everywhere in between. Miigwech, thank you all for being here. Thank you for bearing with us. And I want to turn this over to my friend, Deb Parker from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition.
Haslahel, Sitsayaltsa, Sitsa, Twalchuf, Dotlalep. Good afternoon, dear relatives. My traditional name is Sitsayaltsa. I'm a member of the Tulalip tribes from the state of Washington. I serve as the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition Chief Executive Officer. It is an honor to stand with Secretary Deb Haaland, Assistant Secretary Bryan Newland, and boarding school survivor Jim Lobel Sr. to commemorate the release of the historical work of this Department of Interior and the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition on Indian boarding schools. This is a historic moment as it reaffirms the stories we all grew up with, the truth of our people, and the often immense torture our elders and ancestors went through as children at the hands of the federal government and the religious institutions. The impacts of boarding schools are still with us today. Our children had names. Our children had families. Our children had their own languages. Our children had their own regalia, prayers, and religion before Indian boarding schools violently took them away. The United States wielded assimilative education programs from the early 1800s to 1969. Nearly 200 years of forced labor, displacing Native peoples from their usual and accustomed territories. Removal of their spirit, taking away their traditional foods, and making them pay with their lives as Native children. After generations, we still do not know how many children attended, how many children died, and/or how many children were permanently scarred for life because of these federal institutions. But we are grateful to stand today with an administration who is willing to find out the truth and help us put names to the unmarked graves that cover at least 37 states. This report is a foundational step in what we know will open the doors for deeper engagement and more robust opportunities for truth-seeking. Our recent collaborative work with the U.S. Department of the Interior has identified 408 federally funded and supported U.S. Indian boarding schools, as well as 89 additional boarding schools that received no federal funding at all. Over 2 centuries, these 497 boarding schools operated as a broad system with a singular goal aimed at our children to strip us of our languages, identities, and cultures. These lifeways that have connected us to the land since time immemorial. We must investigate beyond the Department of Interior Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative and compile all previous research and bring together partners for a comprehensive review of federal boarding school policies and their impacts. We must expand upon the great work of the Department of Interior Initiative to know the magnitude of loss of human life. This is why we need H.R. 5444 and Senate Bill 2907, the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act. We must be able to locate church and government records beyond the Department of Interior's reach. The Commission would locate and analyze all records on Indian boarding schools. The Commission would have the power to issue subpoenas to produce records that are targeted to attendance, infirmary, deaths, land, and other correspondence related to boarding schools. We must provide survivors the opportunity to testify and to tell their story as a child of boarding schools and document ongoing impacts from boarding schools. We must understand the full history of intergenerational trauma and how it relates to Natives with regards to current impacts on physical health, mental health, spiritual health, and the health of our community. Our children deserve to be found. Our children deserve to be brought home. We are here for their justice, and we will not stop advocating until the United States fully accounts for the genocide committed against Native children. The time is now. Tigwitsid, Haichka, Bisha, Miigwech. Thanking you in our languages and praying that our languages come back with as much love and strength as our ancestors spoke them. Thank you. At this time, I have the great honor of introducing you to James Zilbell Sr., the first Vice President of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and also a boarding school survivor. A very important story that we need to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah Haaland, Secretary, my fellow elders. Thank you. I was born in an era when Alaska was still a territory, and the federal government had total sway over the entire territory at the time, including its 229 villages, which later became known as tribes. And I want you to know that Alaska Native people experienced a very similar kinds of acculturation and assimilation that occurred in the lower 48 states with the Western expansion. And this came through a guy by the name of Sheldon Jackson, a Presbyterian minister in the 1880s, who was a very fine admirer of Colonel Henry Pratt. And so consequently, a lot of the BIA schools in Alaska are modeled after the one in Carlisle. In fact, many early children that went to boarding school in Carlisle came from Alaska. And some of them are still there, and we want to bring them home. I'm a product of 10 years of boarding school myself, going in at the age of 8 years old. My brother was 6. And I went to 2 BIA boarding schools, Wrangell Institute and Mount Edgecombe High School. And I learned everything about the European American culture, its history, language, civilizations, math, science, but I didn't know anything about who I was as a Native person. I came out not knowing who I was. And I will share that more in detail tomorrow. But what I want to say, the echoes of the boarding school era, even though it ceased or stopped in many places, the vestiges of it is still continuing on today, especially with our high incarceration rates of Native people across America. In Alaska, we have maybe 18% of the state's population, but we are 40% in the criminal justice system. Likewise, 60% of our children that are in foster care in Alaska are Alaska Native children, and 60%. And these are just but some examples of some of the visual things of historical trauma in boarding school. We also have the highest suicide rates in America, murders and suicides and domestic violence. And we're still having to deal with those things today. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak to you, and to hopefully tomorrow you'll also hear more of our stories. Thank you.